typical A2 style errors. And then together, the students and the trainee teacher looked at the phrases and together made them better. They reformulated them. And they came up with the following. So the trainee teacher went with, I like to get up late rather than I like getting up late. She didn't really go into why. And she couldn't decide between breakfast and brunch, so she gave them both options. And so they had then examples of effective phrases, useful phrases that they could then use themselves. So what they did then was, the same task with a different partner this time, nobody taking notes, and then the trainee teacher was going around monitoring for errors. So what I liked about this task, it was a very effective task I thought, what I liked about it was that they looked at phrases that they had produced themselves, so it was authentic for them, and then they were looking at meaning, form, pronunciation together. They did some drilling, and then they felt that they were confident then to use the phrases in a second task. So I think that they were confident at the end of that lesson that they could go out and go into a cafe in Galway and talk about Saturday. So it was a very successful lesson. And this lesson was in the final week of our 4-week full-time CELTA course. Following, they had input on speaking, they had input on TBL, task-based learning. They also had input on classroom interaction. So in the speaking task, the input had come from the learners themselves, and they had reformulated with the trainee teacher and managed the interaction together. And reformulation was a word that they had heard a lot of on the course, the trainee teachers that is. So a form of scaffolding, reformulation, is when, like what parents do with children, isn't it? When a child makes a mistake and the parent says it back to them in the correct way without kind of overtly correcting them. And it was something that they had become aware of on the course. We talked about it a lot in feedback to teaching practice. They'd heard about it a bit in input, and they'd seen some examples in DVD lessons, in live lessons of reformulation. We had a colleague from International House Seville who had done a lot of work on reformulation, and she had given them a very interesting talk about it. So, how many people here observe teachers? Some of you. So I observe a lot of lessons because I work on different teacher training courses here and abroad, CELTA, Delta, mostly in Ireland. And I also carry out inspections on behalf of Equals and International House around the world. So I see a lot of lessons, a lot. And I also speak with many teachers and teacher trainers about lesson planning and teaching. And classroom interaction is always something that I'm interested in. When I did my Delta originally with International House London, it was something that was discussed quite a bit in the course, and I became interested in it then. Then I decided to do a master's in Queen's in Belfast because Steve Walsh, maybe some of you know him, he spoke recently at your conference, the ELT conference in Dublin. Well, he was the tutor on the course, and because his PhD had been on classroom interaction, I decided to go all the way up to Belfast to do a master's rather than do it around the corner in Trinity because I was living in Dublin at the time. But anyway, it was a really interesting course because I learned a lot about it, and then I decided to focus on classroom interaction for trainee teachers on CELTA courses. Steve's PhD focused on self-evaluation of teacher talk, where teachers looked at their own teacher talk, their own classroom interaction, and evaluated it. What I decided to do was look at peer evaluation of teacher talk, because on a CELTA course, well, on any teacher training course, the trainee teachers do a lot of observation. On our course, they do about 30 hours. And so they have a lot of opportunity to observe each other and to examine the different stages in the lesson plan. So what Steve had done was to focus on different modes of interaction within a lesson, such as managerial mode, setting up instructions or whatever, systems mode, where you're focusing on language analysis. So what I did was I divided it into stages of a lesson. So because staging is so important on an initial teacher training course where candidates have to kind of learn how a template of a lesson plan would work for a systems lesson, for a skills lesson. So the observation tool that we used was to focus on their peers and to focus on the different types of classroom interaction at different stages in the lesson, depending on what the actual outcome or objective of the stage was. So classroom interaction traditionally has always been called teacher talk. And when I observe, I do CELTA assessments as well, so when I observe people giving feedback to trainee teachers, we often see things like this. These are the typical kind of comments you'd see on feedback on initial teacher training courses. So they're all in relation, they're all focusing pretty much on quantity of teacher talk. So I think that that's kind of a bit, as well, Steve thinks, and I agree with him, it's quite simplistic, that he wanted to focus more on quality of teacher talk, and particularly on an initial teacher training course. Once they've got rid of all their nerves and they're into week 3, week 4, you can then kind of help them to focus a little bit on how they can manage their interaction with students. So this is the trainee teacher, sorry, what was I going to say? The trainee teachers on the course, they begin to realise how their own teacher talk can become effective and actually work with them to help manage interaction. So teacher talk is now recognised as something it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality. If we look at these comments, this is one from Colin. It's a potentially valuable source of comprehensible input. So what he's talking about here is Cratton's theory of comprehensible input, where a learner will have a greater opportunity to learn when the input is pitched at a bit higher a level to theirs. A bit like me when I play tennis, except I'm not a very good tennis player, but I'd like to play with somebody who's better than me because I can manage to learn something. They might get bored, but I enjoy it. But what Steve has written a lot, that's Steve Walsh again, originally from Queen's, now he's at Newcastle, and to focus on the relationship between language use and the pedagogic purpose of the interaction. And the idea is that when these are well matched, that learning opportunities can occur. So researchers of classroom interaction, they look at the classroom as a communicative context in itself, or a series of contexts which are jointly constructed by the participants in the lesson. So we're looking at classroom interaction and the uniqueness of classroom interaction. The classroom context is very specific, and it's kind of like what we have here today, and it could be for a science class, it could be for a maths class, it could be for an English language class. It's unique in that we have pair work, we have group work, we have somebody leading the lesson, we have somebody managing the lesson. And in that way, it's quite unique. But what makes particularly English language or any language lesson particularly unique is what Allwright said back in 1984, that English language is the teaching objective and it's also the language that we use. So we're teaching something using that something, which is quite unique in terms of language teaching. And that can create some challenges for trainee teachers, because typically they have to grade their language, they have to make sure that the students can understand them, they have to speak slowly, they have to manage it in a way that can sound as natural as possible, but also that it's understandable. But it can also create learning opportunities for students, in that if we can manage our teacher talk effectively, they're actually incidental or even planned learning opportunities within the lesson, managed managed by the teacher with the interaction with students. So we looked a little bit at reformulation earlier, and now we're going to have a look at questions. So the typical kinds of questions that we look at on the CELTA course, and Delta as well. We divide them into 2: display questions, so where we already know the answer, typically the questions that we use for teaching, and referential questions, or real questions where we don't know the answer. And this is where you have to make a little bit more effort, because there's lots of WH questions. You don't know you don't know what the answer is going to be. You don't know what students are going to say. So it does require quite a lot of management on the teacher's part. So because the display questions are also examples of real communication as well, but they're easier to manage by the teacher, whereas referential questions like these, you have to really kind of be listening and trying to manage them and coming up maybe with unexpected language. So it's quite a lot of work especially for a new teacher, and we focus a lot on that on the course. So, but display questions do have their value, and on the CELTA course we look at typical display questions or concept checking questions, which I'm sure you've all worked with, and they're difficult to produce. But so on our training courses, we look at concept checking questions, how to formulate them, and we also, so the typical thing, you're checking the meaning of the language, but we also include at the end a referential question, a real question, to make it seem a little bit less mechanical, and also to up, if we can, the learning opportunity, and to give some opportunities for students to produce real language rather than just mechanical yes, no, sometimes, which are typical answers for concept checking questions. So they do have a pedagogic purpose, but it's nice to kind of mix them a bit with referential questions. So Grenan talks about referential questions and the fact that it requires a greater effort and depth of processing on the part of the learner. It also requires, as Scott Thornbury has said, a greater effort and depth of processing on the part of the teacher, because you have to manage it, as we were saying earlier. But it's something that we can definitely train and help our teachers on initial training courses and on CPD programs to work with. So Steve Walsh then went on to look at classroom interactional competence, and this is more the ability of a teacher or a learner to use effective classroom interaction as a tool for mediating and assisting learning. That's what he calls it. There are some suggested ways to promote it. He talks about allowing learners the space to work, the interactional space to manage the interaction together. We talked a little bit about scaffolding reformulation earlier, display referential questions. So these are very similar to what he had worked on with his initial PhD on self-evaluation of teacher training. So what's emerging, or seems to be emerging, is that interactional competence, it's known as the fifth skill, is set to become one of the major influences on language teaching, testing and materials design. So people are looking at that, and that's why we have decided to include, a long time ago when I set up the CELTA course in IH Dublin, classroom interaction as part of the CELTA. It's not normally on a CELTA course, but I think it's useful for trainee teachers to begin to examine it into the second half or towards the end of their course. If you'd like